My name is Haley Patterson, and I am 18 years old now. But at 13, my world shattered when my mother abandoned me after my father died. While grieving his loss, I discovered she had stolen my inheritance and told everyone I was studying abroad in Germany. For 5 long years, I lived with my caring aunt, while my mother enjoyed a luxurious lifestyle with my money. But last month, everything changed when I finally got justice, and now she is facing the consequences of her betrayal. Before I share my story, let me know where you are watching from. And please hit like and subscribe if family betrayal stories resonate with you. Growing up, I had what many would consider an ideal childhood. My father, Thomas Patterson, was a successful investment banker who worked hard to provide for our family. Despite his demanding job, he always made time for me. Every Saturday morning, he would wake me up early to teach me how to swim at our local community pool. And on Sundays, he would take me bike riding through the neighborhood parks. Homework time was never boring with him around, as he had a way of making even math problems seem like exciting puzzles to solve. My mother, Jessica, on the other hand, always seemed a bit more distant. She was beautiful and charming, especially at social gatherings, but there was always something missing in the way she interacted with me. While my father would get down on the floor to play board games with me, my mother preferred to shop for designer clothes or plan dinner parties with her friends. At the time, I thought this was just how mothers were, and I cherished the attention and affection my father showered on me. We lived in a beautiful 2-story colonial home in a wealthy suburb of Connecticut. The house had a large backyard with a maple tree where my father built me a tree house when I was 7. I spent countless hours in that treehouse reading books and dreaming about my future. Our neighborhood was filled with families similar to ours, and I had several close friends who lived nearby. Some of my happiest memories were our family vacations to Florida. Every spring break, we would spend a week at a beachfront resort in Key West. My father would wake up early with me to collect seashells before the beach became crowded, while my mother preferred to sleep in and join us later for lunch. Those mornings with just my dad and me felt magical, like we shared a special secret world that existed only at dawn. Another beloved tradition in our home was my father's weekend pancake breakfasts. He had a special recipe that included cinnamon and vanilla, and he would create pancakes in the shape of animals or letters. My mother would usually sleep in on these mornings too, missing out on what became some of my most treasured childhood memories. Birthday celebrations in our home were always extravagant affairs. My mother insisted on throwing large parties with professional decorations and catering, inviting families from across the neighborhood and my entire class at school. While I appreciated the effort, what I loved most were the quiet moments after the guests had left, when my father would give me his personal gift, something thoughtful that showed how well he knew me, like the vintage camera he gave me for my 10th birthday, because he noticed my interest in photography. What I didn't fully appreciate until later was that my father was secretly preparing me for my future. During our weekend outings, he would casually teach me about financial literacy, explaining concepts like saving, investing, and the value of money. At 10 years old, I knew what a stock market was and had my own savings account that I proudly deposited my allowance into each week. Our most special tradition was our Sunday morning hikes. We would wake up before sunrise and drive to a nearby nature preserve. As we walked along the wooded trails, my father would share life wisdom, telling me stories about his own childhood and the lessons he had learned through success and failure. He always emphasized the importance of integrity, saying trust and honesty, once broken, are almost impossible to fully restore. Those words would become painfully relevant years later. My father had a passion for photography that he passed down to me. He had a collection of vintage cameras that he treasured, and he taught me how to use each one. We would spend hours in his home office, which doubled as a darkroom, developing photos we had taken together. The smell of the developing chemicals and the magic of seeing images appear on blank paper are sensory memories I still cherish. My parents met in college at Yale, where my father studied finance, and my mother majored in art history. According to the story they told at dinner parties, they fell in love during a campus production of Romeo and Juliet, where my father played Mercutio and my mother was in charge of costumes. They married a year after graduation and had me 3 years later. From the outside, they seemed like the perfect couple complementing each other in ways that made sense. My father was serious and driven, while my mother was social and creative. Looking back now, I can see the early signs of my mother's materialistic nature that I was too young to fully comprehend. She measured success in brand names and social connections. When my father received his first major bonus at work, instead of discussing saving or investing as he wanted, she immediately redecorated our entire house and bought a new luxury car. She was obsessed with appearances, often commenting on other families' financial situations, or criticizing what she called their lack of taste. As my father climbed the corporate ladder and our family's wealth grew, he had to work longer hours. My mother used his absence as an opportunity to immerse herself further into a lifestyle of luxury and social climbing. She joined exclusive country clubs, spent lavishly on clothing and jewelry, and frequently hosted elaborate parties to showcase our home and her newest acquisitions. During these parties, I often felt like a prop brought out in an expensive dress to impress guests before being sent back to my room with the babysitter. Despite my mother's increasing obsession with status, I still had a happy childhood thanks to my father's constant love and my close friendship with our neighbor, Sarah Miller. Sarah practically lived at our house, joining us for dinner several nights a week and participating in many of our family outings. Her own parents worked long hours, and my father welcomed her into our family without hesitation. Sarah and I were inseparable throughout elementary and middle school, sharing secrets, clothes, and dreams for the future. The last truly happy time I remember was Christmas when I was 12 years old. My father had just received a significant promotion, and for once, he took 2 full weeks off work. We decorated the Christmas tree together, baked cookies, and watched holiday movies each night. On Christmas Eve, we drove around the neighborhood to look at the decorated houses, then came home to hot chocolate with extra marshmallows. When I opened my presents on Christmas morning, I found the professional camera I'd been dreaming of, along with a handwritten note from my father promising photography lessons every Saturday for the next year. I had no idea that within months everything would change, and that promise would remain unfulfilled. The new year started with excitement and plans. My father and I mapped out locations for our photography expeditions, and I was looking forward to starting the 7th grade with my best friend Sarah. Everything seemed perfect until a random Tuesday in February, when my father came home early from work looking pale and shaken. My mother was out at her book club, so it was just the two of us when he sat me down and told me he had been to the doctor that day. What I thought would be a routine checkup had resulted in a devastating diagnosis: aggressive pancreatic cancer. Those 3 words changed everything. At first, I didn't understand the gravity of what he was telling me. In my 12-year-old mind, people got sick and then they got better. But the look in my father's eyes told a different story. This wasn't a cold or even a broken bone that would heal with time. This was something much more serious. I remember asking him if he was going to die, and the way his voice broke when he said he was going to fight as hard as he could, but that this type of cancer was very aggressive. He held me as I cried, and for the first time in my life, I saw my strong, confident father look afraid. When my mother came home and heard the news, her reaction struck me as strange even then. Instead of breaking down or rushing to comfort my father, she became almost businesslike, immediately talking about second opinions and treatment options. There were no tears, just a cold determination that seemed more focused on solving a problem than supporting her husband. The next 3 months were a blur of hospital visits, medical terminology, and watching my father deteriorate before my eyes. The strong man who had carried me on his shoulders and taught me to ride a bike became thin and frail. The aggressive chemotherapy ravaged his body, causing him to lose his hair and much of his strength. Still on his better days, he would make an effort to maintain our connection, asking about my school day, or offering weak smiles when I showed him my latest photographs. Hospital visits became our new normal. I would go to school during the day, then my mother's assistant would pick me up and drive me to the hospital, where I would spend the evening with my father. My mother was increasingly absent during these visits, claiming she had important appointments or was meeting with doctors separately. At 13, I was too young to question this, believing that adults handled grief and stress in different ways. As my father spent more time in the hospital, I took on more responsibilities at home and during his care. I learned how to adjust his pillows just right, which ice chips he preferred, and how to distract him with stories during particularly painful moments. The nurses often commented on how mature I was for my age, not realizing that necessity was forcing me to grow up much faster than I should have. During the quieter moments in the hospital, when my father was feeling stronger, we had private conversations about the future. He spoke candidly about his will and the trust fund he had established for my education and future security. He had been meticulous in his planning, ensuring that I would be taken care of financially no matter what happened. He explained that there was money set aside specifically for my college education, as well as additional funds that would become available to me when I turned 25. He emphasized that my mother would be the trustee until I came of age, but that the money was explicitly for my benefit and future. I remember him looking me straight in the eyes and saying, "Haley, this money is for your dreams, for your education, for the life you will build. Your mother will manage it until you're old enough, but never forget that this is your security, your foundation." I nodded, not fully grasping the significance of what he was telling me, more concerned with the idea of losing him than with financial matters. As his condition worsened, we had fewer and fewer of these lucid conversations. The aggressive cancer spread rapidly, and the doctors transitioned from treatment to pain management. The last few weeks were a haze of morphine drips and whispered goodbyes. My father, once so articulate and wise, was reduced to squeezing my hand and looking at me with eyes full of love and regret. The last coherent thing he said to me was, "Be strong, Haley. Trust yourself. You are so much more capable than you know." He died the next day with me holding his hand, and my mother standing at the foot of the bed, her face unreadable. I was 13 years old, and my world had collapsed. The funeral was a grand affair befitting a successful investment banker. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects, many of whom I had never met. Throughout the service, I sat numb and disconnected, unable to process that my father was truly gone. What struck me even then was how my mother seemed more concerned with appearances than with mourning. She greeted guests with practiced grace, accepting condolences with just the right amount of dignified grief, but there was something performative about it all. During the reception afterward, I noticed my mother speaking with several men I didn't recognize. Their conversations seemed intense and businesslike, inappropriate for a funeral. When I approached, they would abruptly change the subject or move away. One man handed my mother a business card, which she quickly tucked into her purse when she saw me watching. In the days after the funeral, my mother's behavior changed rapidly. She became impatient with my grief, telling me that life goes on and we needed to be practical. She made quick decisions about my father's belongings, donating his clothes, and packing away his personal items without consulting me. When I protested wanting to keep his sweater or his favorite books, she dismissed me as being overly sentimental. I found myself struggling with overwhelming grief while my mother seemed to be moving on with surprising speed. She began taking business calls, meeting with lawyers, and discussing property matters with real estate agents. Several times I overheard fragments of conversations about accessing accounts and liquidating assets. At 13, I didn't fully understand the implications, but I knew something wasn't right about how quickly she was dismantling the life we had shared with my father. During this time, my only comfort came from looking through old photo albums and my father's belongings that I had managed to secretly keep. At night, I would wrap myself in his old university sweatshirt that still smelled faintly of his cologne and flip through the photos we had taken together. In those quiet moments, surrounded by tangible reminders of his love, I felt closest to him and furthest from the coldness that had overtaken our home since his death. In the weeks following my father's funeral, our home transformed from a place of warmth and love to an environment of tension and silence. My mother, who had never been particularly affectionate, became increasingly cold and distant. She would lock herself in her office for hours, speaking in hushed tones on the phone, and bristle whenever I asked questions about what would happen next, or how we would manage without my father. Strange visitors began coming to the house, usually when I was at school. I would return home to find unfamiliar business cards on the entry table, or catch glimpses of people leaving as I arrived. When I asked my mother about these visitors, she would dismiss my questions with vague references to estate matters and financial necessities. One afternoon, I came home early from school with a migraine to find my mother and two men I didn't recognize packing away my father's home office equipment. His computer files and even the photography equipment we had shared were being boxed up. When I protested asking why they were taking his things so soon, my mother sharply told me to go to my room and rest. That night, I cried myself to sleep, feeling like my father's memory was being erased from our home piece by piece. About a month after the funeral, my mother announced over breakfast that I would be visiting my Aunt Linda, my father's sister, for the weekend. She presented it as a chance for me to get away from the sadness of our house and spend time with family who had loved my father. Though I was hesitant to leave, the idea of spending time with my aunt, who shared my father's kind eyes and gentle manner, was appealing. I packed a small suitcase with clothes for 2 days, along with a photo album, and my father's Yale sweatshirt that I had been sleeping in. My Aunt Linda lived about 2 hours away, in a modest home in the suburbs of Boston. She was a high school English teacher who had never married, but had a long-term boyfriend named James, who often stayed at her house. When we arrived, my mother barely got out of the car, giving Aunt Linda a quick hug, and me a perfunctory kiss on the cheek before saying she had appointments to get back to. Something in the way Aunt Linda watched my mother's car drive away made me uneasy, but she quickly ushered me inside with promises of homemade cookies and board games. The weekend with Aunt Linda was comfortable and healing. She didn't shy away from talking about my father, sharing stories from their childhood, and showing me old family photos I had never seen. We cried together, but we also laughed at funny memories. And for the first time since my father died, I felt like my grief was acknowledged and respected. When Sunday evening came, I expected my mother to arrive to take me home. But instead, she called to say she needed a few more days to finalize some paperwork and arrangements at the house. Would I mind staying with Aunt Linda until Wednesday? Wednesday came and went with another call and another excuse. Days turned into weeks, with my mother consistently finding reasons why I couldn't come home yet. She needed to meet with more financial advisors. The house was being appraised. She was looking into new schools for me. Each excuse sounded reasonable on its own, but together they formed a pattern that even my 13-year-old self began to recognize as avoidance. Phone calls with my mother became less frequent and shorter. She would ask perfunctory questions about my schoolwork, never waiting for complete answers, before changing the subject to talk about her meetings and appointments. She never asked if I missed home or when I wanted to return, and whenever I brought it up, she would quickly change the subject or find a reason to end the call. One evening, about 3 weeks into my stay, I overheard Aunt Linda on the phone, her voice rising in anger as she spoke to someone I assumed was my mother. "You're still legally responsible for her," Linda was saying. "The trust fund was meant for Haley's education and future, not for you two." When she noticed me in the doorway, she quickly lowered her voice and turned away. Later that night, I asked her what she had been talking about, but she deflected, saying it was just grown-up business that I shouldn't worry about. The next time my mother called, her tone was different, almost artificially cheerful. She had exciting news, she said. An opportunity had come up for me to attend an exclusive boarding school in Germany. She explained that it was a prestigious program that would look excellent on college applications, and that she had already handled all the arrangements. I was confused and upset. I had never expressed any interest in studying abroad, and the thought of being so far away from everything familiar, especially so soon after losing my father, was terrifying. When I protested, saying I wanted to come home and finish the school year with my friends, particularly Sarah, my mother became dismissive. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Haley," she said firmly. "Your father would have wanted you to have the best education possible, and this is it." When I continued to object, her tone hardened. "The decision has been made. You'll thank me later." Over the next few days, I tried repeatedly to call my mother to discuss the situation, but she either didn't answer or kept the conversations brief, saying she was too busy with paperwork for my international transfer to talk long. Meanwhile, Aunt Linda seemed increasingly concerned, having whispered conversations with her boyfriend James that stopped whenever I entered the room. The situation became even more bewildering when Sarah called me at Aunt Linda's house, confused and hurt. She wanted to know why I hadn't said goodbye before leaving for Germany. When I told her I wasn't in Germany and had no plans to go, there was a long silence before she said, "But your mom told my parents you've already left. She showed them pictures of your new school and everything." That was the moment I realized something was deeply wrong. My mother had not only decided to send me away, but had already told people I was gone. When I confronted Aunt Linda with this information, her face crumpled, and she finally sat me down for an honest conversation. My mother had no intention of taking me back or sending me to Germany. The German school was a lie she had created to explain my absence to family and friends, without admitting she had abandoned her responsibilities as a parent. The truth came out in pieces over the next few days. My mother had already sold our family home. She had accessed my father's accounts and the trust fund he had established for me. According to what Aunt Linda had been able to piece together, my mother was planning to move to California to start a new life without me. The reality of my situation crashed down on me all at once. I wasn't temporarily staying with my aunt. I had been discarded by my own mother. As the weeks turned into months, my mother maintained the fiction of my German education to everyone who knew us. She would send occasional generic postcards to relatives with vague updates about my fictional European adventures. Her communication with me became increasingly rare, usually limited to brief phone calls on holidays or my birthday. Each call felt like a performance, as if she was checking a box on a list of minimal parental responsibilities. Meanwhile, her social media told the real story. Though she had blocked me, friends would show me posts of her traveling to exotic locations, dining at exclusive restaurants, and shopping at designer boutiques. She had completely reinvented herself as a wealthy, carefree divorcee, never mentioning that her husband had died or that she had a daughter. The money that was meant to secure my future was funding her extravagant new lifestyle. My 13th birthday, just 2 months after my father's death, was spent in Aunt Linda's modest kitchen, with a homemade cake and a few small presents they could afford. My mother sent a generic card with a gift certificate and called for exactly 4 minutes, most of which she spent talking about a charity gala she had attended the previous night. As I blew out the candles on my cake, I wished not for material things, but for understanding. I couldn't comprehend how the woman who had given birth to me could so easily erase me from her life. Life at Aunt Linda's modest two-bedroom home in the Boston suburbs was vastly different from the luxury I had known in Connecticut. Aunt Linda was a high school English teacher who lived on a teacher's salary in a small house with creaky floors and outdated appliances. But what the home lacked in grandeur, it made up for in warmth. There were bookshelves in every room, comfortable if worn furniture, and the constant smell of something delicious baking in the kitchen. Aunt Linda made extraordinary efforts to provide stability in my suddenly chaotic life. She cleared out her home office and converted it into a bedroom for me, painting the walls my favorite shade of blue, and finding a secondhand desk where I could do my homework. She consulted with a school counselor about helping a child through grief and abandonment, and she made sure to check in with me every day about my feelings and concerns. Starting at a new school in the middle of the year was one of the hardest challenges. I went from being a popular, well-adjusted student at my old school to the new kid with the mysterious background. Rumors spread quickly. Some kids had heard I was an orphan, others that my parents were getting divorced. Unable to face the humiliation of explaining that my mother had essentially thrown me away, I became withdrawn and quiet, focusing on my schoolwork instead of making friends. Depression hit me hard during those first few months. I would wake up in the middle of the night crying for my father, only to realize that I had also lost my mother, my home, and everything familiar. There were days when getting out of bed felt impossible, when the weight of abandonment and grief pressed down on me so heavily that I couldn't move. Aunt Linda noticed my struggles, and despite her limited resources, found a therapist who agreed to see me on a sliding scale. Dr. Marshall, my therapist, helped me process both my grief over my father and the complex emotions surrounding my mother's abandonment. She explained that my mother's behavior was a reflection of her own character flaws, not a statement about my worthiness of love. Through weekly sessions, I began to understand that I hadn't done anything to deserve abandonment. Some people, Dr. Marshall explained, are simply incapable of the selfless love that parenting requires. Gradually, with Aunt Linda's stability and Dr. Marshall's guidance, I developed a new routine. I would wake up early to help Aunt Linda prepare breakfast before school. After school, I would do my homework at the local library until Aunt Linda finished teaching. Then we would have dinner together, often joined by her boyfriend James. Weekends were for household chores, trips to the discount movie theater, or walks in the local park. It wasn't the life I had known, but it had its own simple rhythms and comforts. Unlike my mother, Aunt Linda was completely honest with me about our situation. She explained that she had tried to challenge my mother's decisions legally, but lacked the financial resources to hire the kind of lawyers who could go up against the expensive legal team my mother had retained. She told me that my father had indeed left a substantial trust fund for my education and future, but that my mother, as the trustee, had found ways to access and misuse those funds. The truth about my inheritance came out in bits and pieces. According to what Aunt Linda had been able to discover, my father had left approximately $2 million in trust for me. The money was primarily intended for my college education, with the remainder to be given to me when I turned 25 to help start my adult life. My mother, as the sole trustee after my father's death, had managed to manipulate the terms, claiming emergency needs and finding legal loopholes to drain the accounts for her personal use. While my mother lived in luxury with my inheritance, Aunt Linda struggled financially with the additional expense of raising me. Her teacher's salary was enough for one person to live modestly, but adding a teenager to the household stretched her budget to the breaking point. I became acutely aware of the financial strain my presence caused, noticing how Aunt Linda would mend her clothes instead of buying new ones and clip coupons for grocery shopping. When I turned 16, I insisted on getting a part-time job to help with expenses. After school and on weekends, I worked at a local coffee shop, contributing to household expenses and saving whatever I could for college. The work was exhausting on top of my schoolwork, but it gave me a sense of control and independence that I desperately needed. I wasn't going to be a victim of my circumstances or a burden to the only adult who had stood by me. During my time with Aunt Linda, I developed new interests and talents that helped with my healing process. I joined the school newspaper, discovering a love for writing that I had never explored before. I also became involved in the drama club, finding that acting allowed me to express emotions I couldn't always articulate in real life. These activities not only helped me process my grief and abandonment, but also began to form a new identity beyond being the girl whose mother didn't want her. Aunt Linda's boyfriend James became an unexpected source of support and a positive male role model in my life. A construction contractor with a gentle demeanor, James would often help me with math homework, teach me practical skills like changing a tire or fixing a leaky faucet, and attend my school events when his work schedule permitted. He never tried to replace my father, but he offered a kind of steady, undemanding male presence that I hadn't realized I needed. One of the most painful aspects of my new life was the occasional encounter with old family friends who believed the lie about my studying in Germany. During a summer visit to a shopping mall in a neighboring town, we ran into my mother's former book club friend who exclaimed with delight, "Haley, what a surprise! Are you home from Germany for the summer?" The confusion that followed was excruciating as I stammered through a vague response, while Aunt Linda quickly steered me away. These encounters became painful tests of my ability to maintain dignity in the face of humiliation. Some people were shocked and sympathetic when they learned the truth, offering belated condolences and support. Others seemed almost pleased to discover the scandalous reality behind my mother's perfect facade, eagerly spreading the gossip through their social circles. The hardest to bear were those who didn't believe me, insisting that there must be some misunderstanding because my mother had shown them photos of my German school and read them my letters. Throughout this time, my mother maintained only the most superficial contact with me. She would call on Christmas and my birthday, send the occasional text message asking how school was going without waiting for a detailed response, and once or twice a year send gift cards that seemed randomly chosen as if she couldn't remember my interests or preferences. Each interaction was brief and performed like an actress reciting lines for a role she didn't particularly enjoy. Despite all these challenges, I managed to maintain good grades and even excel in school. My teachers noted my resilience and determination, and by my junior year, I was taking advanced placement classes and beginning to research college options. Aunt Linda, though, worried about how we would afford tuition without access to the trust fund my father had established, encouraged me to aim high and apply for scholarships. Looking back, I can see how those years with Aunt Linda, though difficult, and not what my father had planned for me, shaped me into a stronger, more independent person. I learned to value authenticity over appearances, to find joy in simple pleasures rather than material possessions, and to recognize the difference between people who truly care and those who simply perform caring when it suits them. Most importantly, I learned that family isn't always defined by blood, but by who shows up for you when you need them most. As my 17th birthday approached, I began to think more seriously about my legal rights and the inheritance my father had intended for me. Though Aunt Linda had explained the situation as best she could, I wanted to understand exactly what had happened and if there was any possibility of recovering what was rightfully mine. The more I learned about college costs, the more I realized how difficult it would be to achieve the education my father had wanted for me without access to the funds he had set aside. One rainy Saturday afternoon, while Aunt Linda was at a teacher's conference, I found myself searching through the boxes of papers in her home office for a permission slip I needed signed for a school field trip. In a folder labeled Patterson Family Documents, I discovered a copy of my father's will that Aunt Linda had kept. Unlike the simplified explanation I had been given as a grieving 13-year-old, the actual legal document spelled out in precise detail the provisions my father had made for me. The will confirmed what Aunt Linda had told me. My father had established a trust fund of just over $2 million for my education and future. The document specified that the money was to be used exclusively for my benefit, my education, healthcare, and general welfare until I turned 25, at which point any remaining funds would transfer directly to me. My mother, as trustee, was legally obligated to manage these funds solely for my benefit, with annual accounting to be provided to the law firm that had created the trust. Reading through the detailed provisions, I felt a fresh wave of grief for my father, who had been so careful to provide for me, and rage toward my mother, who had so completely betrayed his intentions and my future. The will also revealed that my father had owned our family home outright with no mortgage, and had intended for me to inherit it when I turned 21. According to the document, my mother had the right to live there until then, but not to sell the property without court approval and placement of the proceeds in trust for me. Armed with this new information, I began conducting internet searches on my mother's whereabouts and activities. Though she had blocked me on social media, many of her accounts were public, and through friends' accounts, I could see evidence of her extravagant new lifestyle. There were photos of a stunning modern home in Malibu, with ocean views, a brand new Mercedes convertible, trips to Paris and Tokyo, and designer shopping sprees. The captions never mentioned me or my father, instead, portraying her as a successful independent woman enjoying life to the fullest. Most shocking was the discovery of my mother's new boyfriend, a fitness trainer named Ryan, who appeared to be at least 10 years younger than her. His own social media was filled with photos of them on exotic vacations, dining at exclusive restaurants, and attending celebrity events. In one particularly painful post, he thanked my mother for the best birthday present ever, a luxury sports car that he posed beside keys in hand. I couldn't help but think that car had been purchased with money meant for my college education. When I showed these findings to Aunt Linda, she finally shared the full story of what she knew. After my father's death, she had indeed tried to fight for my inheritance, hiring a modest local attorney with her savings. However, my mother had retained a team of high-powered lawyers from my father's former firm, who overwhelmed Aunt Linda's attorney with legal maneuvers and procedural complexities. Without the financial resources to continue the fight, Aunt Linda had been forced to give up the legal battle and focus instead on providing me with a stable home and emotional support. That evening, I met with my high school guidance counselor, Ms. Winters, and shared my situation. She listened attentively, then made a phone call to a friend who worked at a legal aid society that specialized in cases involving minors. Within a week, I had an appointment with Mr. Goldstein, a semi-retired attorney who took cases pro bono when he felt passionate about the cause. After hearing my story and reviewing the copies of my father's will, Mr. Goldstein agreed to represent me without charge, his eyes flashing with indignation at what had been done to me. With Mr. Goldstein's guidance, we began the painstaking process of gathering evidence of my mother's fraud. We collected bank statements showing suspicious transfers, property records, revealing the sale of our family home without court approval, and social media posts documenting expenditures that were clearly not for my benefit. Mr. Goldstein also obtained records showing that my mother had forged documents to access the trust fund, claiming to be using the money for an exclusive boarding school that I never attended. One of the most disturbing discoveries was learning that my mother had gone to family court shortly after my father's death and obtained full custody by claiming that I was having severe behavioral problems and needed specialized schooling. She had presented false evidence, including fabricated reports from non-existent therapists, to support her case. The court had granted her petition without ever speaking to me or investigating the claims given her status and expensive legal representation. The deeper we dug, the more we discovered that several relatives and family friends had been suspicious of my mother's story but had been convinced by her elaborate lies. My father's cousin Robert admitted that he had questioned why I never called during my supposed time in Germany, but had been placated when my mother showed him forged report cards and a school brochure. My father's former colleague had actually traveled to Germany for business and offered to visit me only to be told that it was against school policy to have visitors outside of designated family weekends. Mr. Goldstein worked tirelessly to locate witnesses who could testify to my mother's statements about my fictional German education. He found our former housekeeper, who had overheard my mother on the phone with a real estate agent discussing selling the house immediately and moving to California with no mention of me joining her. He tracked down my father's former assistant, who remembered my mother asking about how to access the trust fund accounts just days after the funeral, well before any supposed plans for international education. As the evidence mounted, I experienced a complex mixture of emotions. There was vindication in knowing that my suspicions were confirmed, but also a deeper pain in seeing just how calculated my mother's betrayal had been. This wasn't a case of a grieving widow making poor decisions in the aftermath of tragedy. The evidence showed a methodical, premeditated plan to abandon me and steal my inheritance, a plan that had begun almost immediately after my father's death. Mr. Goldstein explained the potential legal consequences my mother could face. Beyond being forced to return the misappropriated funds, she could be charged with fraud, embezzlement, and perjury. These were serious charges that could result in fines and even imprisonment. As angry as I was, I struggled with the idea of being responsible for sending my mother to jail. Mr. Goldstein gently reminded me that I wasn't responsible for the consequences of her actions. She was. After weeks of gathering evidence and preparing the case, I faced the difficult decision of whether to move forward with legal action. It would mean public exposure of our family situation, potentially drawn-out court battles, and directly confronting the mother who had abandoned me. Despite my hesitation, I ultimately decided that I needed to stand up for myself and for what my father had wanted for me. With Aunt Linda's support and Mr. Goldstein's guidance, I chose to pursue justice not out of vengeance, but out of respect for my father's wishes and my own future. The legal process began with a formal filing to recover my misappropriated inheritance. Mr. Goldstein prepared extensive documentation detailing the trust provisions, my mother's breaches of fiduciary duty, and the evidence we had gathered of fraud. When the papers were ready, he arranged for a process server to deliver them to my mother's Malibu address, ensuring that she could not ignore the legal action being taken against her. My mother's response came quickly and furiously. Within hours of being served, she called Aunt Linda's house demanding to speak with me. When I got on the phone, her voice was a mixture of rage and panic. "How could you do this to me after everything I've done for you?" Her words were so disconnected from reality that I almost laughed. What exactly had she done for me besides abandoning me and stealing my future? I remained calm, simply telling her that the matter was now in the hands of our respective attorneys. That single phone call opened the floodgates. My mother began calling multiple times a day, leaving voicemails that ranged from tearful pleas to vicious threats. When I stopped answering, she started texting, sending emails, and even messaging my friends from middle school trying to reach me. Her attempts at manipulation were transparent. She would switch from claiming she had always intended to give the money back to insisting she had used it for my benefit to threatening to contest my father's will entirely if I didn't drop the case. Meanwhile, she hired Barnett and Associates, one of the most expensive law firms in California, to represent her. Their first move was to file motions to dismiss the case, claiming that as trustee, my mother had full discretion over how the funds were used. They also argued that the statute of limitations had expired for contesting her actions. Mr. Goldstein, despite being semi-retired and working pro bono, countered each motion, expertly pointing out that as a minor, I could not have been expected to take legal action earlier, and that fraud had no statute of limitations in cases involving fiduciary duty to a minor. As we prepared for court, I experienced increasing anxiety and nightmares. I would wake up in cold sweats, having dreamed of facing my mother across a courtroom while she laughed at me. Dr. Marshall, my therapist, helped me develop coping strategies and reminded me that confronting my mother was an act of courage, not cruelty. Aunt Linda and James created a protective bubble around me at home, limiting my exposure to the stress of the case while ensuring I had space to process my feelings. The first court appearance was scheduled for a preliminary hearing to determine if there was sufficient evidence to proceed with the case. I insisted on attending despite Mr. Goldstein's assurance that my presence wasn't required. I needed to see my mother face to face after nearly 5 years of abandonment and lies. I wanted her to look me in the eyes when the truth of what she had done was laid bare in court. Walking into the courtroom that morning was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Aunt Linda held my hand tightly as we made our way to our seats beside Mr. Goldstein. When my mother entered with her 2 attorneys, I almost didn't recognize her. She had lost weight, dyed her hair a lighter blonde, and had the taut, smooth skin that suggested cosmetic procedures. She was dressed impeccably in a conservative navy suit that probably cost more than Aunt Linda's monthly salary. Our eyes met briefly across the room, and I was shocked by the coldness I saw there. There was no remorse, no maternal love, not even recognition of the pain she had caused. She quickly looked away, whispering something to her attorney and straightening her expensive pearl necklace. In that moment, I understood with complete clarity that the mother I had known or thought I had known no longer existed if she ever had. The judge, an older woman named Judge Harriet Rosenthal, reviewed the documentation provided by both sides. As Mr. Goldstein presented the evidence of my mother's misappropriation, Judge Rosenthal's expression grew increasingly grave. She asked pointed questions about the sale of our family home, the fabricated German school, and the luxury expenditures documented through social media and financial records. My mother's attorneys attempted to characterize the situation as a simple misunderstanding between a grieving widow and a troubled teenager, but the judge seemed unconvinced. When it was my mother's legal team's turn to present their case, they tried a different approach. They began painting me as an unstable, money-hungry teenager, manipulated by my aunt who was jealous of my mother's wealth and success. They claimed that the German school story had been a protective measure because I had actually been in a residential treatment facility for behavioral problems. They even suggested that my father had verbally modified his wishes before death, telling my mother to use the money as she saw fit to rebuild her life. I sat there stunned by the blatant lies, watching my mother nod along, as if these fabrications were absolute truth. Mr. Goldstein, however, was prepared. He immediately presented affidavits from my teachers and school counselors, testifying to my excellent academic record and emotional stability. He showed documentation proving no such treatment facility stay had ever occurred. Most devastatingly, he played a video deposition from my father's lawyer, confirming that no modifications to the trust had ever been discussed or documented. The preliminary hearing continued with testimony from key witnesses. Aunt Linda spoke powerfully about the years she had spent caring for me, describing how she had found me a therapist to help with my grief, attended every parent-teacher conference, and created a stable home despite limited resources. Her voice broke when she described finding me crying over old photographs of my father, asking why my mother didn't want me anymore. Former family friends testified about my mother's elaborate lies regarding my supposed German education. Our former housekeeper described overhearing my mother on the phone with a real estate agent just days after my father's funeral, discussing selling the house immediately and moving to California with no mention of me joining her. Each testimony built a clearer picture of calculated abandonment and fraud. The most shocking moment came when my mother decided to take the stand herself against the advice of her attorneys. Perhaps believing her charm and social skills would sway the judge, she began weaving a tale of a heartbroken widow overwhelmed by grief and the pressures of single parenthood. She claimed that sending me to live with Aunt Linda had been a temporary measure that somehow extended as she dealt with her emotional trauma. The German school story, she insisted, had been a well-intentioned lie to protect my privacy and shield me from the gossip of their social circle. Her testimony began to unravel under Mr. Goldstein's cross-examination. He methodically walked her through bank records showing transfers from my trust fund directly to accounts used to purchase her Malibu home and luxury vehicles. He presented social media posts where she described herself as happily single with no responsibilities while on vacation in Bali. When confronted with the forged documents used to access the trust fund, she became flustered and contradictory, first denying knowledge of the forgeries, then suggesting her financial advisor had handled those details, and finally claiming she couldn't remember due to the fog of grief. The judge's patience visibly thinned as my mother's testimony became increasingly inconsistent. The breaking point came when Mr. Goldstein presented evidence that my mother had begun consulting with real estate agents about selling our family home while my father was still in the hospital. When asked directly if this was true, my mother hesitated, then responded, "Thomas and I had discussed downsizing." The blatant lie was too much even for her own attorneys, one of whom closed his eyes in resignation. Judge Rosenthal interrupted at that point, her expression stern. "Ms. Patterson," she said, addressing my mother, "this court has heard substantial evidence suggesting not just financial impropriety, but a deliberate scheme to defraud your own child of her inheritance while abandoning your parental responsibilities. I find it particularly troubling that you appear more concerned with maintaining appearances than acknowledging the harm you've caused." My mother's composure finally cracked. Tears of frustration, not remorse, welled in her eyes as she realized the judge wasn't buying her performance. She turned to glare at me as if I were the cause of her problems rather than her own actions. In that moment, with everyone in the courtroom watching, the full truth of who my mother was became undeniable. The preliminary hearing concluded with Judge Rosenthal ruling that there was more than sufficient evidence to proceed with the full case. She also issued an immediate freeze on all of my mother's assets. Pending resolution, appointed a forensic accountant to trace the misappropriated funds and referred the matter to the district attorney's office for consideration of criminal charges. As we left the courtroom, I noticed my mother's boyfriend, Ryan, was conspicuously absent. I later learned through social media that he had broken up with her as soon as her assets were frozen and the true source of her wealth was exposed. The woman who had abandoned me for a life of luxury was beginning to experience abandonment herself. The final court ruling came down decisively in my favor. After reviewing the mountain of evidence presented during the full hearing, Judge Rosenthal ordered my mother to repay the entire misappropriated inheritance, plus interest, within 30 days. The total came to nearly $3 million, accounting for the original trust fund, plus the proceeds from the unauthorized sale of our family home and the investment growth that should have occurred over the 5 years. To ensure compliance, the court immediately froze all of my mother's assets and accounts. Her Malibu home, purchased with my trust fund money, was placed in receivership pending potential sale to satisfy the judgment. Her luxury car's designer wardrobe, and even her jewelry collection were inventoried and appraised for potential liquidation. The lavish lifestyle she had built on the foundation of my stolen inheritance was collapsing around her. In addition to the civil penalties, the district attorney decided to pursue criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and perjury based on the evidence uncovered during our case. My mother was facing not just financial ruin, but the very real possibility of imprisonment. When offered a plea deal that would include community service, financial restitution, and probation instead of jail time, she reluctantly accepted, unable to risk a trial, with the overwhelming evidence against her. The days following the court decision were a whirlwind of emotions for me. There was a sense of vindication in having the truth acknowledged and justice served, but also lingering grief for what should have been. I had won the case, but I had lost years with my father and any possibility of a normal relationship with my mother. No court ruling could restore the family that had been taken from me or erase the pain of abandonment. While I felt justified in pursuing the case, I took no joy in watching my mother's life fall apart. Despite everything she had done, a small part of me still remembered the woman who had once read me bedtime stories and bandaged my skinned knees. I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction, sadness, and strange emptiness as the news of her legal and financial downfall spread through our former social circle. In the aftermath of the ruling, my mother made desperate attempts to reconcile with me. She sent tearful emails claiming she had always loved me and had somehow convinced herself that what she was doing was for the best. She left voicemails promising to make everything right if I would just give her another chance. These attempts at connection only came after she had lost everything, making it impossible to see them as anything but self-serving. After careful consideration and many sessions with Dr. Marshall, I decided to maintain firm boundaries with my mother. I would not shut the door completely, leaving open the possibility of a relationship in the future, but I would not rush to forgive or forget. Any reconciliation would need to be on my terms, with genuine accountability and change behavior from her side. I wrote her a letter explaining this decision, making it clear that I needed time and space before considering any kind of relationship. With the recovered funds, I was finally able to secure the education my father had intended for me. I enrolled at his alma mater, Yale University, planning to study law with a focus on family and trust law. The symmetry felt right, like I was honoring my father's legacy while forging my own path forward. I established a scholarship in my father's name at Yale, setting aside a portion of the recovered money to help other students who had lost parents at a young age. Aunt Linda and I found a small but comfortable apartment near the Yale campus, where she could live with me during my freshman year to help with the transition. After 5 years of financial struggle while caring for me, she was finally able to take a sabbatical from teaching to work on the novel she'd always dreamed of writing. Seeing her enjoy this well-deserved break was one of the greatest joys to come from the resolution of the case. Therapy continued to be an essential part of my healing process. Dr. Marshall helped me work through the complex emotions that surfaced even after the legal victory. There was anger that still needed to be processed, grief that still needed to be honored, and a future that needed to be reimagined. Through our sessions, I learned that healing isn't linear, and that justice, while important, is just one step in the longer journey of recovery. As part of my mother's plea deal, she was required to complete 500 hours of community service at a youth shelter for abandoned and neglected teens. The irony of this assignment wasn't lost on anyone, but reports from the shelter supervisor suggested that the experience might actually be having a positive effect on her. For the first time, she was confronted with the stories of children whose parents had discarded them, perhaps allowing her to see her own actions in a new light. After much deliberation, I decided to allow limited supervised contact with my mother after she'd completed half of her community service. Our first meeting was at a cafe near Aunt Linda's home, with Aunt Linda present as support. My mother appeared greatly changed from the glamorous, confident woman I remembered. Without her designer clothes and professional makeup, she looked older and somehow smaller. For the first time since my father's death, she seemed to look at me as a person rather than an inconvenience. That first conversation was awkward and painful, with long silences and careful words. My mother attempted to explain herself, saying that grief had made her selfish, and that she'd convinced herself I would be better off with Linda while she rebuilt her life. I didn't accept these excuses, but I did recognize the glimmers of genuine remorse in her eyes when she finally apologized without qualifications or deflections. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. As I settled into my college life, I found a new sense of purpose and direction. The experience of fighting for justice had shown me the power of legal advocacy, inspiring me to pursue a path where I could help others who had been victimized. I joined a student legal aid clinic in my sophomore year, working with families navigating trust and estate issues, particularly those involving vulnerable beneficiaries. I also worked to rebuild connections with extended family and old friends who had believed my mother's lies about Germany. Most were horrified when they learned the truth and offered belated support. Sarah, my childhood best friend, and I reconnected during my first college break, spending hours catching up and reestablishing our bond. These renewed relationships helped fill the gaps in my support system and connected me to happy memories of my father. One of the most meaningful moments came when Aunt Linda and James finally got married after 10 years together. They had delayed their wedding partly due to the financial strain of caring for me, so I insisted on helping with the costs as a small repayment for everything they had done. Standing beside Aunt Linda, as her maid of honor watching her marry the man who had been a steady presence in our difficult years, I felt the power of chosen family. Biology had failed me through my mother, but love had prevailed through Aunt Linda and James. As for my mother, her journey toward redemption was slow and uncertain. After completing her community service, she found a modest job at a local bookstore and moved into a small apartment, living a life unrecognizable from her former luxury. During our occasional meetings, she seemed to be developing genuine insight into her actions and their impact on me. While I remained cautious, I recognized that people can change when forced to confront the consequences of their choices. Looking back at the 5 years since my father's death, I can trace a path from devastating loss through abandonment and betrayal to eventual justice and healing. I have learned that resilience doesn't mean avoiding pain, but moving through it with purpose. I have discovered that self-worth cannot be determined by someone else's inability to love properly, even a parent's. Most importantly, I have found that family can be created through choice and commitment, not just through blood. Today, as I stand on the cusp of my adult life, I carry with me both the painful lessons of my mother's betrayal and the loving wisdom of my father's legacy. I choose to honor him, not through anger or bitterness about what happened, but by living according to the values he taught me during our Sunday morning hikes: integrity, compassion, and courage. Justice was important, but finding peace within myself has been the greatest victory. For those of you who have faced betrayal by those who should have protected you, I hope my story offers some comfort and courage. Family wounds cut deepest, but they can heal with time, support, and the determination to create a different future. The people who hurt us don't get to define us unless we let them. Have you ever had to rebuild your life after betrayal? How did you find the strength to move forward? Please share your experiences in the comments below. And if my story resonated with you, consider subscribing to hear more journeys of resilience and recovery. Thank you for listening. And remember that your worth is never determined by those who failed to see it.